PAAIA is a non-profit, non-partisan, non-religious organization that serves the interests of Iranian Americans and represents the community before U.S. policymakers and the American public at large. PAAIA works to expand opportunities for the active participation of Iranian Americans in the democratic process, provide opportunities for advancement for our next generation, and foster greater understanding of the Iranian people and culture. We are very excited to be here today to present the findings of our 2016 poll of Iranian Americans. Following the presentation of the survey findings, a panel of Iran experts will be on hand to discuss the status of the nuclear negotiations, internal dynamics within Iran's government, and the regional implications of a nuclear deal with Iran. First, I would like to thank our congressional sponsor, Congressman Gerald Connolly, for working with us in bringing you this briefing and panel discussion. I would also like to thank our distinguished panelists for joining us today on what promises to be a very informative discussion on this important topic. I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today, Mr. Alireza Nader. Alireza is a senior international policy analyst at the RAND Corporation and author of The Days After a Deal with Iran, Continuity and Change in Iranian Foreign Policy. His research is focused on Iran's political dynamics, elite decision-making, and Iranian foreign policy. His commentaries and articles have appeared in a variety of publications, and he's widely cited in the U.S. and international media. Alireza's other RAND publications include Israel and Iran, A Dangerous Rivalry, The Next Supreme Leader, Succession in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Saudi-Iranian Relations since the fall of Saddam. Saudi-Iranian Relations since the fall of Saddam, Rivalry, Cooperation, and Implications for U.S. Policy, The Rise of the Pasdaran, Assessing the Domestic Roles of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Prior to joining RAND, Alireza served as a research analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses. He's a native Farsi speaker, and he received his MA in International Affairs from the George Washington University. I hand you over.
Well, thanks a lot. Good afternoon. Thanks to PAAIA for organizing this and showing us their fascinating survey. Just want to open up the conversation to the panel and talk about a number of issues. There are a lot of things to talk about regarding Iran and the nuclear issue and the Middle East in general. And after we're done, I'd like to open it up to questions and answers. But I really want to start with the nuclear issue. And you have the bios for the panelists, so I'm not going to go into it. I'm just going to go into the discussion right away. But I really want to talk about the nuclear issue. And I want to start with you, Kelsey. What do you think is happening with the nuclear agreement? Would you describe it as a success, as a failure? As we all know, it was a very heated issue in the United States. There was a lot of disagreement over the nuclear issue. A lot of people are saying it has been a success, whereas in recent weeks, Iran has also tested ballistic missiles that some are arguing are a violation of the agreement, if not violation of the nuclear agreement, JCPOA, but a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. So if you could just give us your overall assessment of the nuclear program to start with and whether you think it's a success or a failure.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. My job, I think, actually is quite easy in that respect, because from a technical perspective, implementation of the agreement has actually proceeded quite smoothly since the International Atomic Energy Agency certified in January that Iran had taken all of the key steps under the agreement to get the sanctions relief provided in the deal. And as many of you know, that included removing over 13,000 centrifuges, reducing its stockpile of enriched uranium to below 300 kilograms, and putting in place very extensive monitoring and verification mechanisms, including continuous surveillance at key sites like where Iran actually conducts its uranium enrichment. And really, since that date, the IAEA has continued to certify that Iran is meeting these requirements. And there have been a few very small issues where there has been disagreement over some terminology within the deal, but all of those have been clarified sort of quite quickly without even involving the Joint Commission, which is the body that was set up by the deal as a dispute resolution mechanism. The IAEA has already reported out once to its Board of Governors that Iran is continuing to meet its commitments. There was one small issue reported whereby Iran had slightly exceeded its production of heavy water under the deal. That's something it'll use for a reactor that it's building for research purposes. But it quickly rectified that and shipped the excess material out. So I think that really speaks to not only how well the deal is proceeding, but that when these small areas have arisen where there have been differences of opinion between Iran and the P5+1, they've been able to clarify them quite quickly. And I think it's telling that the biggest controversy over implementation of the deal, has very little to do with the deal itself and actually is focused more on the ballistic missile section, which, under the UN Security Council resolution that endorsed the deal, Iran is called upon not to test or develop missiles that are designed to be nuclear capable. And that's slightly different from the old language, which prohibited Iran from testing missiles that are nuclear capable. So that's why, we've seen Iran say it's permitted to test these missiles, but the U.S. say that it's not in harmony with the resolution. And unfortunately, I think we are likely to see those ballistic missile tests continue because Iran does view the testing of these missiles as part of its national security. I would say, though, that we certainly should not be complacent when it comes to the technical elements of the deal. Iran still has a deadline that it needs to meet by January of 2017 that has to do with removing some of the infrastructure from its Fordow enrichment plant, which is no longer used for uranium, but for certain types of isotopic research. It needs to remove some of the supporting infrastructure within the next year. And there also have been no substantial challenges to International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors because they haven't needed yet to access sites outside of Iran's declared declared nuclear facilities. In one of the largest controversies over the deal was inspector access to military sites if there were concerns about illicit nuclear research. And under the deal, the IAEA has to be able to access those sites if it has had suspicion. So none of those areas have emerged yet. That could certainly be a challenge to the deal. The deal also regulates Iran's procurement of materials that could be used for illicit nuclear purposes or even for dual-use purposes. But there have been no attempts by any Iranian entity yet to purchase materials through that dedicated procurement channel. The Joint Commission has to approve all of those purchases and then can check on them in Iran to make sure they're not being used for nuclear purposes. So that could be an issue as well. So I think it will be important to remain vigilant, to watch those areas, to ensure that compliance continues. But certainly up until this point, the deal has really proceeded very smoothly and certainly is a non-proliferation bonus for the United States.
Thanks. That's a great summary. So hypothetically, let's say there are issues over inspection of the military sites outside of Iran's enrichment facilities. What are some scenarios you see that could be problematic? What are some sources of disagreement between Iran and the IAEA? And what's really the process for adjudicating the disagreements? Because to me, it seems like a very technical nature that is not always fully grasped.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure many of you will remember in the debate over the deal, there was a lot of controversy about international inspectors accessing a military site called Parchin. And that is where the international community believes that Iran conducted certain types of explosive experiments relevant to developing a nuclear weapon. So moving forward, to protect against Iran blocking IAEA access to these sites if concerns arise about military activities related to nuclear weapons development, the deal puts in place a procedure by which the IAEA can request access to that facility. And this isn't carte blanche access. Iran can take some steps to protect military-sensitive information. And that, I think, is one area where we could see controversy or differences of opinion moving forward. Ultimately, it's up to the IAEA to decide that it has the access that it needs to ensure that there are no illicit activities. So if Iran insists on taking measures that the IAEA says will impede its ability, and that could include, for instance, covering certain types of control panels within a building, blindfolding inspectors as they go into a site to ensure that they cannot see certain areas of a military facility, or putting sort of stipulations on how samples are taken from the ground or from buildings. If the IAEA deems that is that Iran is requiring it to do, that Iran is keeping back too much, that it can't actually verify that there has been no military activities, I think that could create some controversy, and that then will go to the Joint Commission, which is comprised of Iran, the P5+1 members, and a member from the European Union. And they'll have sort of about 2 weeks to adjudicate and decide if Iran's demands for secrecy are reasonable or if they need to concede more. And then if Iran does not let the IAEA into a site sort of based on the agreement to the Joint Commission, that then can revert to the Security Council, and there's option to impose sanctions then. So I think kind of that decision over what the IAEA can access and how much they can access will certainly be will be an area where there could be concern going forward. And I think it's worth adding there that this isn't just, what the IAEA thinks might be suspicious in Iran. When we talk about monitoring and verifying Iran's nuclear activities, the U.S. intelligence community, the intelligence communities of a number of other countries, Israel, European countries, are also going to be watching Iran, and they can provide the IAEA with evidence if they choose to do so about what might constitute concerns or potentially what they might view as a violation, and the IAEA can act on that information. So I think that's another layer of redundancy and monitoring that often is left out of the conversation.
So let's say the adjudication process goes forward and Iran is blamed, but it refuses to comply. What happens next?
If Iran refuses to comply, then any of the countries can go to the Security Council and say that Iran has not complied with the agreement, and can quickly sort of put sanctions back in place. And there does not need to be an affirmative vote of the Security Council to do this. The resolution was written in such a way that essentially vetoing a resolution would put the sanctions back in place. It sounds slightly counterintuitive, but that essentially protects against, China or Russia, I think, who are the biggest concerns, blocking the imposition of sanctions if Iran is found in violation. And certainly any of the P5+1 members, the United States, the European Union, can snap their own sanctions back into place as well.
So this brings me to the question of sanctions, and this is a question for Peter. This concept of snapback sanctions, there are several commentators and analysts who disagree that there's even such a thing. That, one criticism of the nuclear agreement was that once Iran implements the beginning stages of it and is met with sanctions relief, then it is basically free to violate the agreement in the future without coming under severe pressure through sanctions, because it takes a long time for sanctions.
Certainly from a technical legal matter, the U.S. could reimpose our unilateral sanctions very quickly through a series of executive orders and executive branch actions. And the European Union, although it would require negotiations among all 28 member states, could also reimpose in short order as a technical matter. So I think that the processes are there. I think that there is a credible threat of snapback, and I think that is a credible threat to the Iranians. That said, I think we're obviously all, we all recognize that in the real world, if there is a small violation, if there were a relatively minor violation, there would of course be a lot of diplomatic negotiations to be had there, and I think you'd probably see it take, a reasonable period of time before the sanctions, in fact, came back. And so I think in that kind of a scenario, you probably would see some time. But I think the sort of criticism you often hear, which is that the Europeans would never come along in the real world and joining us and reimposing sanctions, that kind of thing. I just disagree with that. I mean, it was not easy. It is true it was not easy to get the Europeans out of Iran and the Asians out of Iran in the first place, but we did it. And I think that given the investment we have all collectively put into the Iran nuclear deal, not just the United States, but our allies and partners. Not going to say it would be easy as a practical matter, but I think if you're looking at a violation, a real violation, I think it is a credible snapback mechanism.
Right. Especially if Iran is found to be violating it and the international community agrees. And of course, there has been some criticism of the nuclear agreement within Iran, although I would argue Iran's political system overall supported it. But Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, made a speech recently for the Persian New Year, Nowruz, and he criticized sanctions relief. Basically, he said the economy is not improving and the United States is not living up to its side of the agreement. And we've heard that Iran is having a difficult time accessing the global financial system that is still basically shut off, that Iranian banks can't do business, even though a lot of European and Asian banks and companies want to re-engage Iran. And there have been reports that the U.S. government and the White House especially is considering some steps in terms of facilitating Iran's access to the financial system. So what are your thoughts on that? What can the United States do at this point to make sure the agreement is enforceable and that Iran is meeting the necessary sanctions relief?
Well, that's also just a terrific question. Let me begin by just offering a couple of thoughts on what the administration has done to date, because I actually think there's been what I view, having spent time at the State Department, as an unprecedented effort to try to, from a U.S. perspective, to try to ease sanctions here and to try to make it feasible for businesses around the world that want to do allowed business in order to do that business. I mean, so we saw an incredibly detailed set of regulatory guidance come out from OFAC back in January, 30 pages of FAQs, dozens of pages of regulatory guidance documents. We've seen Treasury and state officials travel around the world to try to do engagement with financial institutions, oil companies, other companies. So I think we've actually seen a very impressive outreach effort to try to deliver on America's commitments under the deal. And I think that the administration has said, as they have said, they recognize the importance of the United States meeting its obligations under the deal. Treasury Secretary Lew reiterated that in a speech just a couple of weeks ago, where he brought up the fact it was important, if we want to have sanctions as leverage, it's important that the person we're negotiating with, the country we're negotiating with, understand that if they meet their terms of the deal, we'll meet our terms of the deal. That said, I think everyone who has worked on sanctions recognizes that the unwinding of them was not going to be instantaneous, and there were almost certainly going to be implementation challenges that arose along the way. We've certainly seen some business resume, right? If you look at Iran's oil exports, they've begun exporting to Europe again. They've begun exporting to other countries that were not importing Iranian oil during the sort of peak sanctions period. We've seen a series of announcements around deals by European companies going back into Iran in a variety of different sectors, and so I think we've seen announcements of Airbus, for example, selling aircraft to the Iranians. We're definitely seeing business materialize here. I actually think, looking at it as an analyst, the business has actually been proceeding faster than I would have expected, being candid, given how complicated some of the regulatory schemes are. So I think we are actually seeing relief. I think it's probably not what the it's not as much as the Iranians were hoping for, as we saw the Supreme Leader say, I think really for two reasons. First of which is just we're in a different, especially when you look at energy markets, we're in a different global situation than we were 2 years ago. And so while Iran can sell more oil, they're only getting 35%, 40% of the price that they would have gotten 2 years ago for that oil. So I mean, just the market logic is they're not going to get as much money as they might have hoped for 2 years ago, and that's not really something the Americans have anything to do with or should have anything to do with. That's just a market reality. The other fact is, to your point, financial institutions have been heavily scarred by very large fines they've paid for previous sanctions violations, and so I think are really, for very understandable reasons from a business perspective, exceptionally risk averse when it comes to Iran or other embargoed countries, and it's not something that they are particularly eager to rush back into. And I think we're going to, reality is we're going to continue to see a lot of the large global banks probably shy away from Iran. I do think we're beginning to see some smaller banks, mid-sized banks begin to look at, providing some of the financial relationships Iran would like there. But I think the reality is that there's a market element to this that's not, strictly speaking, sanctions, that we're probably going to see this to be a continuing source of friction despite all the steps the Treasury Department's been taking.
Would you say that also transparency is an issue in Iran? Because the Iranian central bank governor was recently, I believe, in New York and Washington, D.C., and on CNBC, I believe, he said that transparency is not an issue. Iran is complying with international norms and standards.
So we're all aware that some of these prohibited actors, like the IRGC, have a heavy economic footprint in Iran, and when you look at a very opaque business environment where you don't always know who you're doing business with, ensuring that you are not doing business with a prohibited actor can be quite difficult, and it feeds into this risk aversion that we are talking about. There's also just a general problem, because of the legacy of the sanctions and the fact that a lot of the Iranian banks during the sanctions period engaged in a lot of sanctions evasion. I think Western banks looking at these Iranian banks really have no idea what their, as Iranian banks, internal compliance processes are, what controls they have in place, and those kinds of things. And until some of the Iranian banks are going to be able to show that they have really robust internal controls and compliance systems so that they, as Iranian banks, aren't kind of bringing these prohibited actors into their systems and then on into the Western bank systems, I think it's going to remain a very risky thing for Western banks to look at.
And I would imagine it's difficult to do due diligence when the Revolutionary Guards have such a heavy involvement in Iran's economy. And that's something that I think is coming up even more regularly now. What is the assessment of the Revolutionary Guards? How is important is this force in Iran today? Because the Iranian central bank governor also said that the Revolutionary Guards are not a big player and they're not going to be an issue. So, Alex, what do you think? When you look at what's going on in Iran today, how would you describe the role of the Revolutionary Guards? And, in D.C. there's been this debate that the nuclear agreement has empowered so-called moderates versus hardliners, and that the parliamentary elections demonstrated that more so-called moderate forces are winning in Iran today. And that also the Revolutionary Guards has taken a back seat. What's your assessment of the role of the Guards, the parliamentary elections, and how we should read the balance of power in Iran today?
Sure. Thank you. Again, thanks to PAAIA for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. Ali Reza, to answer your question, I think it's important to go back to 2011 and remember that the nuclear deal was something that was initiated basically in the office of the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. In other words, it was not Hassan Rouhani who came in summer of 2013 and said, this is what we're going to do. And he basically picked up a fight with the other centers of power. The other two main centers of power in Iran being the IRGC, the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps, and the office of the Presidential Palace. So what you have in Iran, if I could put it this way, is three centers of power. The IRGC generals are on one hand, you got the presidency and his moderate team, and then you got the supreme leader. What the supreme leader is doing in Iran today is basically trying to balance these two other factions against one another. And what he does is classical in the sense of the history of the Islamic Republic. If you go back to Ayatollah Khomeini back in 1979, the guy maintained power for 10 years until his death in 1989 because he knew how to balance other factions. And that's what Khamenei, the guy who is the supreme leader of Iran, is trying to do today. And in balancing these two other centers of power, he has basically said to the Revolution Guards generals, look, we needed a deal. We cannot send someone like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to sit down and deal with the Westerners. He's simply not the kind of man we need for that job. And I think that explains to us why Rouhani was allowed to run for the presidency in 2013 and win. And it was a win that was basically accepted not just by the Supreme Leader, but also by the IRGC. So that was his message. We need a deal, and Rouhani brought them a deal. But now Khamenei is putting the brakes on. And there's a reason for that. Khamenei fears what Rouhani might want to do with the windfall that is coming from this nuclear from this nuclear deal. Why does he worry? And that would be my final point. He worries because today everything in Iran has to do with the succession process. So we're talking about the legality around the deal, but I can tell you a lot of the folks who are fighting over the words that are in the GCPOA are fighting because they're worried about the day Khamenei dies, are they going to be politically in a position to put the next supreme leader in place? So it's become a political football in many ways in Tehran.
So how would you rate the power of the Revolutionary Guards?
I would say they're certainly in a position to sabotage what Rouhani is trying to do, and we see that. I mean, when you have someone like Siamaki Namazi, a good friend of ours, who was picked up in Tehran airport, someone who's tried to bring foreign investment into Iran for a very long time, someone who clearly cares about Iran. When they pick him up and put him away the way they have done, they do so for one reason, to make a point to the Rouhani government that, look, we're still here. You can talk to the French, to everybody else out there, but we're here, and unless we get a cut of what is being generated in terms of new economic interest in Iran, unless we get our cut, we'll undermine you. And they haven't figured out if they're going to be able to accommodate one another yet. That's why you see so much of that factional struggle for power in Tehran.
So you would say the Guards is still a very decisive force in Iran today?
I would say so, yes.
And with the parliamentary elections, Iran had parliamentary and elections for the Assembly of Experts in February.
Yeah.
And a lot of analyses basically stated the elections were a victory for more moderate forces. But can you just tell us who won in these elections, who's in parliament now, what's the makeup of parliament, what's the makeup of Assembly of Experts, and why does that really matter to the United States?
Right.
I mean, should we even be looking at these elections as being very significant?
You would have noticed I didn't put the Majlis, the parliament, as one of the
Right.
centers of power. I don't think the Majlis matters that much. The Majlis the Iranian parliament, can make life difficult for the executive, the president, but can't stop him. The people that can stop him officially, obviously the supreme leader, he's God's representative on the planet. So basically, when he says the legislation is bad, you don't really have much space for an argument. And the Revolutionary Guards people can do what I just described, sabotage it from the side. So Majlis, and whatever you have a reformist majority, or a moderate majority, which is what we ended up with after the 26th of February elections, that was a symbolic win. But in practice, I don't think the Majlis is going to be able to basically be the steering behind a strategic shift of Iran either this way or the other way.
Okay. And internally in Iran, we often hear about the elections and the relative power of the different centers, and much of the discussion on Iran has been focused on the nuclear issue and the issue of sanctions on Iran's regional policies. But it might be me, you don't hear much about the human rights situation in Iran and the state of civil society. So, Suzanne, I'm wondering if you could describe to us what you think is happening in terms of human rights in Iran, especially since Rouhani was elected. He's been a president for, 2.5 years now. Has the situation under Rouhani's presidency changed? And since the nuclear agreement went into effect, has Iran witnessed any major changes when it comes to issues that are important to everyday Iranians, whether there are social, religious, and political freedoms?
Thank you, and thanks very much to PAAIA. I would say I think in 8 or 9 years of working on Iran at Brookings, this is maybe only the second time I've been asked to come and focus specifically on the human rights issues, and I think it's an important set of issues and one that shouldn't be neglected in the broader conversation about Iran that we have in Washington. We spend an awful lot of time thinking about Iran as a nuclear issue. And that is in no way a sort of comprehensive understanding of the challenges that we face in dealing with Iran. It's a challenging set of policies to address, in part because there is a certain consistency in Iranian behavior and treatment of its own people since the revolution. This came out in sort of stark form with the recent publication of a letter written by Mehdi Karoubi, the former Speaker of the Parliament, actually came here to New York back in 2001 and met with a few congressmen at the time in a sort of very quiet but interesting overture between the two governments. Karoubi has been under house arrest, a fairly severe form of house arrest, allowed really no contact with the outside world. Some of the descriptions of the conditions that he and another leading political figure, the former prime minister, Mir Hussein Mousavi, both of whom were candidates in the 2009 presidential elections and leaders of the uprising that followed in its aftermath. The conditions that they have been under for the past 5 years are really harrowing. No sunlight, no outside contact, huge deterioration in their physical and mental conditions. Karoubi recently wrote a letter that was pirated and published, asking explicitly Hassan Rouhani for a trial, and promising to accept whatever the verdict was, but effectively challenging the president to live up to the invocation that he himself and that the reformists who preceded him under former President Khatami really made the centerpiece of their program, which is a commitment to rule of law. And Karoubi published this letter. It got a lot of attention, and the response in the hardline press was vociferous. And in one particular publication associated with the Revolutionary Guard, the writer reminded Karoubi that, in fact, you stood up and supported the house arrest of a previous dissident cleric, the once successor of Ayatollah Khomeini. You, in fact, supported all of these policies. So if you want to go back to the golden age of the Islamic Republic, you're living it right now. And I think that that is the frustrating condition that we see within Iran, that despite radical changes in the social composition of the country. I mean, you have a population now that was born primarily after the revolution. They don't, in a lot of cases, too young to remember even the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. They're young, they're incredibly well educated, they're technically very literate, they are engaged with the world even if they're not, they don't have the extent of exposure that they'd like. And tremendous change within the political system itself, despite the fact that it's still a theocracy and you still have some of the same characters in power. There's been a lot of change, but there has been a certain consistency in the way that Iran treats dissidents, in the way that Iran treats religious minorities, most particularly the Baha'i community, who are subjected to some of the worst conditions and really complete deprivation of political and social and educational rights. The growing pace of executions in Iran, of course, these are directed for the most part at crimes related to the drug trafficking issue that is a genuine security issue that Iran faces, but it gets to this fundamental question of a lack of rule of law and an insufficient commitment to genuine justice, which was, of course, the promise of the Islamic Revolution to the Iranians who participated in it. We've seen with the coming of spring, the return of the morality police to the streets. The question is, do we look at this as all sort of hardliners trying to undermine Rouhani? That's a very convenient narrative, and I understand I'm susceptible to it myself. But the simple reality is this is the way this government functions. This is the way this system was set up to function. And it would take dramatic change to see any real improvement in that context.
Well, what kind of changes are we talking about here?
Fundamentally, it would be real accountability on the part of the government, real accountability on the part of the judiciary. These are policies that we are not, in a direct position to influence, but they should never be at the bottom of our list of issues that we talk about when we talk about Iran. And I would say, we tend to focus on the plight of Iranian Americans, particularly up here on the Hill. There have been a number of members of Congress who were quite influential in pushing for the release of individuals back in January, and that was incredibly valuable. That pressure should continue. There are still Iranian Americans in prison. Siamak Namazi, known to many here in Washington, and his father, who was lured back to Tehran with the promise of actually being able to visit his son in prison and then arrested at the prison, an 80-year-old man subjected to those kinds of conditions. But whenever we talk about the plight of Iranian Americans, and I reiterate, I really want cases like Siamak's and others to be remembered, we've got to address the broader issue of human rights in Iran. It's amazing to me that the Islamic Republic has effectively disappeared two of its long-standing political leaders, the former prime minister, former speaker of the parliament, 5 years in dark rooms and kept from the public eye without any real public pushback on the international stage. Why aren't we talking about these sorts of measures? In the same way that we consistently hammered on the nuclear issue. I don't have any illusions. The Europeans are never going to come on board with any kind of economic pressure when it comes to political and civil rights within Iran. But I think that we know from the experience of individuals who've been in prison and been released that it does matter to them to hear that the international community is engaged with their plight, that various governments around the world are continuing to remind the world that this should not stand. And so I think that that is a role that the Congress, in fact, can play quite well.
So what should the United States do? I mean, considering that the United States and Iran have a very complicated history, that the Iranian regime consistently claims the United States is engaged in a velvet revolution against Iran to undermine its system. And even Iranian activists, so some of them have argued that a very overt U.S. involvement in human rights issues actually is damaging to their efforts. What would you say the United States should do? And this includes the executive branch, the president, and Congress as well.
Well, I think our approach can't be hamstrung by the underlying paranoia of the Islamic Republic because it exists irrespective of what we do. If we remain silent on human rights issues, they don't in any way presume that to be an exoneration of American interference in their internal affairs. That is a baseline presumption for them. And even in the debate within the Iranian press and among Iranian political figures about the response to the missile tests, there were those saying, look, see, this is exactly what we promised you. You give a little on the nuclear, they'll come after you for missiles, and next is human rights. Let's make that true. Let's put the same amount of pressure on the human rights issues that we have on all the other issues of concern with respect to Iran. And I will say, at times in my own work on Iran, I was quite skeptical about the value of funding, about the value of robust engagement from the United States on these issues because of the fear, because of the sense of taint that it creates. I am still one who believes that in 2009 the Obama administration did the right thing by not trying to embrace the green movement too publicly or too dramatically, precisely for those reasons. But I do think in a situation where the civil society of Iran remains very much a sort of low priority for the international community at this stage. Businesses are rushing in, diplomacy, heads of state, you've got nonstop traffic to Imam Khomeini Airport. We should be providing the same flows of interest and flows of money to civil society organizations where they're willing to accept it, understanding that there are going to be risks with that. There are going to be risks in everything that we do with Iran. In this, I'll just underscore, I spoke recently with a woman, not an American, but a European, who had been studying in Tehran and found herself detained for weeks and forced to undergo really harrowing kind of treatment that is quite ordinary for Iranian citizens, false confessions, a really terrifying experience. We're going to see these kinds of risks increase as more people-to-people contacts expand now that the sanctions have been removed, now that the diplomatic relationship is a little bit more stable. We're prepared to accept those risks. You know, I think that everybody acknowledges that there's going to be some moments of crisis. So we should be prepared to accept some risks when it comes to advancing human rights and prospects for civil society within Iran.
And this question is for both you and Alex. When it comes to change in Iran, and there was a lot of talk about the nuclear agreement bringing change to Iran, how do you feel about change? Are you optimistic? Are you negative? What are some of the main obstacles to social and democratic reforms?
I'm a long-term optimist about Iran. I think Iran is best situated to make a successful transition to democracy when and if its people choose to move in that direction. I am not optimistic about the prospects for the nuclear deal sort of creating the conditions for liberalization of the government. I don't believe, and in fact, my research bears out that economic liberalization and the inflow of foreign investment does not tend to have a corresponding liberalizing political effect within Iran. But I do think that the long-term trajectory for Iran is one, you know, the country's been on that trajectory for 100 years now, plus, but it is one that is very positive. And when and if Iran's moderation of its nuclear policies is matched by moderation of its other policies around the region and at home, Iran will be a tremendously important country in the region.
What do you think?
Thanks. No, I pretty much agree with everything Suzanne just said. The biggest thing Iran has as a country going forward, as far as the future of democracy is concerned, is not just a youthful population, but the very dynamic civil society that you have in this place. You can't take that away. For 37 years, Khamenei and his people among the hardliners and others, frankly, have tried that. And they have failed. If anything, you can say civil society has been very much a factor that shaped the identity of the Islamic Republic today. And I think, as Suzanne said, that's positive, that will stay. But Ali Reza, as we look at Iran right now, one of the things that I can't avoid getting all excited about as someone who's an Iran analyst and read everything that comes out of that country every day, as I said, and something I hinted at earlier, is a succession process. The nuclear agreement, as I said, has become a political football in Iran. Every side, when they say, Rouhani, you got us nothing and you gave everything away, it's not so much about the nuclear agreement. Because in fact, as we heard, they've done everything in terms of implementing the nuclear agreement. But at the same time, they want to use this nuclear agreement to hit one another domestically, because there might be a day soon where they have to select the next supreme leader. And this is something, by the way, that you increasingly hear openly, even from the man himself. In his last speech to the Assembly of Experts in Tehran, which you can pick up on YouTube or on his own personal website, Ayatollah Khamenei spoke to the members of the Expediency Council, which is basically Iran's version of the Council of Cardinals, the ones who are going to choose the next Iranian pope. And he says openly, and this is relatively rare, he says, look, the next members of the Assembly of Experts very likely will have to choose my successor. And that tells you something about the atmosphere in Tehran politically. So we need to put everything in the context of this power struggle, and it's going to potentially be an extremely nasty power struggle. Again, I don't want to bore you with history, but if you look at the last time the Iranians had a succession process to go through, if you look at the declassified CIA cables, this country's analysts, best brightest brains, started talking about the succession crisis as early as summer of 1979. Right? And for 10 years, everybody's worried about the succession crisis. Now, Khamenei is 77 years old. He could be around for another 10, 15 years. But I'll tell you, you can't ignore the fact that his age, rumors about his health might get the better of him, and you need to be prepared. And that's what's happening right now. The IRGC generals and Rouhani need to figure out, can they compromise? Because one thing is sure. The first generation revolutionaries that took over this country in 1979, they're all either dead or dying. There is no compromise candidate after Khamenei. Who is the guy who's going to... I mean, in the case of Khomeini in 1989, when he died, you had a couple of candidates who could come in and fill the man's shoes, or at least try, and Khamenei succeeded. But there is no such cleric today. There is no compromise candidate. So either the generals and the clergy plus the moderates elsewhere in the system will find a way forward in the event that this succession crisis, comes at them hard earlier than many of us might have anticipated, or we might actually enter something pretty interesting in the sense of political instability in Iran that we haven't seen for a very long time. Because folks in Iran, unfortunately, do believe in this zero-sum game. If Rouhani wins, I lose. Unless that calculus changes, political stability in Iran can be guaranteed as we go forward.
So be focused on the succession issue. That makes a lot of sense. I want to just close by asking each of the panelists a final question. I'll start with you, Kelsey. If you had the opportunity to give advice to the next U.S. president on Iran and the Iran nuclear program, what would you say?
I would stick to the parameters of the agreement, and if you want to go after Iran's ballistic missiles, history demonstrates that sanctions are not the most appropriate tool to do so, despite sort of the narrative of increasing sanctions to prevent ballistic missile development, but to strengthen interdiction measures within the region and begin thinking now about how to deal with non-proliferation and Iran's potential ability to ramp up uranium enrichment, 15 years down the road when those expire. Because if you start now, then I think you can come up with a regional solution so we don't end up sort of back in the position where we need to negotiate again 15 years from now.
So you don't think the next U.S. president should tear up the agreement?
Definitely not,
okay.
and certainly not on the first day.
All right. What about you, Peter? What would your advice be to the next U.S. president? And it doesn't have to be the president. Also, what should the role of Congress be in the future when it comes to the nuclear agreement? I think that's a very important component as well.
Yeah, well, let me offer a thought on that first with respect to the next U.S. president. Look, I think the next U.S. president is going to have kind of two parallel things they should be thinking about on sanctions with Iran. First is continued implementation of the nuclear deal, and as long as Iran is adhering to its side of the deal, maintaining the sanctions relief implementation and dealing with the technical challenges that will come up. And the second of those is how do you respond, whether it's through sanctions or other measures, to some of these non-nuclear provocative actions the Iranians have made, whether it's missile launches or arrests of U.S. citizens or various other things. And I think you need to be thinking about what your sanctions and non-sanctions toolkit is. I think it's in the very back of my mind. Very back of their mind, and entirely contingent on events in Iran down the road, you do get to this question, if there is a transition in the supreme leader, if there is some kind of transition in Iran, you want to have done a little bit of strategizing about what your scenarios might be for that so that you can move quickly if events do change on the ground in a quick manner on Iran.
Okay. What about the role of Congress? How can Congress best use its powers to make sure that this agreement is enforced by Iran?
Well, look, I think Congress has been playing obviously very strong oversight role. of the nuclear agreement. I think it's been healthy, frankly, for Congress to play that strong oversight role, and the next Congress should continue to play that with the next president. But the next Congress should, like this one, in the end, make sure to give the next president a little bit of breathing room to keep the deal alive, as long as the Iranians are complying with it.
All right, that makes sense. Suzanne, your thoughts?
I think the most important thing that the next administration, and to a lesser extent the Congress, can try to do is to avoid getting caught up in this presumption that we can pick winners in Iran. I see even in this debate about the sanctions relief, this sort of effort to say, well, you've got to help the moderates by showing a little leg, by leaning a bit forward in terms of the implementation of the deal, because that's going to strengthen Rouhani versus his domestic opponents. We have absolutely no track record of success when it comes to picking winners within Iran. And I don't think that U.S. endorsement / alignment with individual Iranian political figures or even groupings tends to help their prospects within the Islamic Republic. This is a system that we don't really understand even now, 37 years later. And so I think...
except for us, right?
Except for us.
Right.
We have perfect holistic understanding. And so I think that there is just this tendency to view Iran as a bunch of white hats and black hats, white turbans, black turbans, Revolutionary Guard bad guys, moderates / reformists, good guys, however we might define them. The simple reality is that we should support any government in Tehran that adheres to its commitments, that upholds rule of law, that adopts responsible policies within the region, all the other standards that we would apply to any other state in the world. And trying to influence the power struggle such as it has been in its evolving fashion for almost 4 decades is really a fool's errand.
Alex?
That's a tough one. What to say to the next U.S. president as far as advice goes. Look, if you look at the Islamic Republic today, we got, let's just for the sake of argument say, 2 key factions, the moderates and the so-called hardliners. The moderates today, folks like Rafsanjani, 20 years ago, was the hardliners.
Right.
They were the ones who were cracking down. If you go back 20 years ago, reformists hated Rafsanjani more than they hated Khamenei. But today, Rafsanjani plays the reformist card. And if you look at Rafsanjani's relations with folks within the regime, you see how many of these people at the top echelons of the Islamic Republic are married into one another's families. And they're connected to one another in ways you couldn't imagine if you actually start looking at personal connections. My point is this. Don't get all excited about the policy prescriptions that they put forward, because it doesn't necessarily means that much. What it is they need to use different narratives to gain some political legitimacy within the population. That's the Republican part of the Islamic Republic. We always sort of focus on the Islamic part, which is the theocracy part, the supreme leader part, but there's a Republican part to this country. And that's what folks like Rouhani and so on need to sort of cater to. But end of the day, what I'm trying to say is there's a power struggle, and it's not necessarily that deep in terms of ideological differences. It's basically a power struggle that's about, you talked about IRGC. What's IRGC more worried about than anything else today? Peter talked about the energy sector. Why is it that the Iran oil contract hasn't gone anywhere since it was launched? Because the commercial terms aren't necessarily that attractive, and people are worried about what IRGC would do, because IRGC is worried it's going to hurt in terms of its economic interest. So what I'm trying to say is, if you're the United States and you look at Iran, and again, Suzanne and I don't know if you don't mind me saying this, I'm sure. We were on a APAC panel just a few weeks back. And somebody asked a question about, was I for the deal or against the deal? And I said, look, there are things about this deal that I didn't like. There's nothing, obviously, about the human rights situation in Iran, all the rest of it. But if you pose the question, do you want war with Iran or a diplomatic solution, I still believe war would be a terrible outcome, and you rather narrow it down to something where you can manage it. That's my bottom line. But at the same time, I am, I recognize that so much else is lost in making that kind of admission as far as the human rights situation in Iran is concerned.
Okay, great. Thanks to all. I'd like to open the floor to questions on any of what we talked about, or even regional issues. We didn't address a lot of regional issues, so feel free to ask anything you like. Yes, please.
I am actually interested in regional issues, so I'd like to address questions. To the extent that we accept that there are hardliners and reformists, and to the extent that there may be ideological differences apart from the economic interests that may be at stake, how would you, and in particular Alex and Suzanne, how would you describe, or is there, and if there is, how would you describe any basic consensus between these groups, these various groups in contention? Is there a consensus, a bottom line, at least common denominator on the issue of, say, rivalry with Saudi Arabia, what Iran's interests are elsewhere in the region, and Iran's interests in the JCPOA in the U.S.?
That's a great question. Suzanne, is there a consensus on the rivalry to Saudi Arabia and on a lot of other regional issues?
There's a diversity of political views within the Islamic Republic, and I didn't mean to suggest that that was not the case. On foreign policy issues today, there is not a clear-cut differentiation. It's more a difference in tone. So there is broad-based support for Iran's intervention on behalf of Bashar Assad in Syria. There is broad-based unease with the tensions that exist with the Saudis, and I think a broad-based sense of uncertainty about exactly how to resolve them. Because for the most part, it's the Saudis who've been rebuffing Iranian overtures to try to find some kind of mechanism for conflict de-escalation. But there are certainly big distinctions in the way that the Revolutionary Guard command structure might talk about and or deploy resources to address Iranian interests across the region, and the way that to the probably furthest end of the permissible political spectrum, those residual elements of the reform movement that remain in the parliament and in other aspects of the Iranian system in positions of authority would construct a foreign policy if in fact they had full authority. I put Rouhani somewhere in the center, and I put him in fact as someone with a better relationship with the security bureaucracy and a deeper sympathy with their perspective than he's often credited with, in part because of his longstanding role as Iran's national security advisor and engagement with all of the policies that characterize this system over the course of the 1990s and up until 2005.
Peter?
I do think the first kind of company that knowingly or, with willful blindness gets into bed with an IRGC firm, I think will want to send a fairly strong message to that company to deter the others. In terms of civil society, I think this is a great question. I mean, it's something I worked on when I was at the State Department doing sanctions, something I've done a little bit of informal advice on for civil society organizations. Look, I very much believe that we have a long-term interest in fostering sort of civil society to civil society cooperation in Iran. I mean, I very much take Suzanne's point. It's hard to draw a direct line between, doing that today, 3 weeks from now, you see the emergence of a moderate faction. There's a complicated domestic politics in Iran that others on the panel know much more about than I do. But I do have a sort of fundamental American belief that it would be in our interest to look at ways with the sanctions that remain, principally on what Americans can do, to see if there are ways we can actually maybe even ratchet some of those back to make it a little easier, just for civil society cooperation, sort of cultural cooperation, things that frankly pose no threat to us, but over time do have some potential, I think, to help empower ordinary citizens in Iran.
Do you have comments?
Yeah, I was actually part of the first, what I believe I've been told was the first post-revolutionary academic exchange between the United States and the Iranians back in 1998. And I have nothing but praise for that kind of activity. It's a phenomenal opportunity, and I know that there's a lot of it that has already was taking off really post-2013. I will say that when you go to Iran, the Iranians' response is great to have some Americans here, but when is our chance? And so young Iranians want opportunities to travel to the United States and probably see that more favorably than they do Americans coming to that country. Although I would note that there have been rising trends of Iranian students coming to the United States, irrespective of all the diplomacy. This has just been a sort of a post-9/11 trend that I think hasn't been remarked upon enough. There are risks in that, as I said. I mean, I know of a number of students, all non-Americans, all countries that have business relationships and diplomatic presence in Iran, who found themselves in a lot of difficulty. Totally unpredictably, with no political activity on their part whatsoever. And so I think as we see more sort of people-to-people activity, we're going to run into more consular issues, which may beget the question of should there be some kind of an official consular channel beyond the existing relationship with the Swiss. And that shouldn't be sort of ignored as we throw money at exchange programs. What are the kind of supportive diplomatic institutions that we need to have to make this possible? And just one final point on the kind of increased tempo of Iran's economic relationships with Asia and Europe. Unfortunately, we've seen this happen before, and to date, there isn't a sort of positive correlation between business openings and positive political change within Iran. It's not to say that it can't happen, but there hasn't been that kind of positive cycle of a virtuous cycle of change within Iran. And I think that part of that is because of the state's control of the economy. This is something that Rouhani, and for purely structural reasons, is looking to change, but that kind of change doesn't happen quickly. And so I think, for the canaries in the coal mine, it's probably not going to be the big ticket deals that are the real change, but things like succession and some of the political shifts that are really going to be most influential in terms of changing Iran's policies.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Actually,
yes, of course. Anybody.
The cooperation. There's a little referenced section in the deal that actually has to do with technical cooperation on nuclear security and safety issues. And it actually calls in some areas for these types of exchanges and trainings, scientist to scientist, particularly to train personnel on nuclear security and safety issues in Iran, which is a huge concern because Iran's nuclear security safety regulations are not made public. And one of their reactor Bushehr is located on a fault line. And additionally, now that Iran has resolved its noncompliance issue with the IAEA, it can work through the agency's Technical Cooperation Fund, which can, again, sort of facilitate these types of shared and joint scientific research projects on the nuclear side. So, I mean, that's sort of less civil society. It's a very narrow sector, but I think it's an important element that the United States should encourage because it's a great way both to advance the deal and advance those interactions.
Alex, thanks.
Thank you. Maybe if I could look at it from a slightly different angle. If I'm an American policymaker, where does Iran fit into my global strategy? I've been focusing on Iran's position on the nuclear issue, Iran's position in Israel, all the rest of it. But as you know, priorities shift. Today, U.S.-Russian relations are what they are, could get worse. Where does Iran's relations with Russia fit into Americans looking at this country of 80 million, which before the sanctions was the 20th largest economy in the world? But not only that, it could be a potential partner against non-state actors in the region, the ISIS of this world and so on. And do I want to see the Islamic Republic fall into the lap of the likes of Russia and China? This year, they're going to potentially become members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Is that the end for U.S.-Iran relations? And we tend to look at Iran-U.S. relations as one of hostility forever and ever. But the fact is, since Second World War, Iran has been an ally of the United States longer than it's been a foe of the United States. We've got 2 more years where we get to a point where it's going to be. But I'm trying to make the point of, commercial ties are all great. But the fact is, U.S. has learned to live without the Iranian market. Boeing might be excited about going there selling as many planes as Airbus did, but and the energy firms are out there. It's got the largest gas reserves in the world. It's got the second largest conventional oil reserves in the world. These are big, but the fact is almost 40 years later, U.S. companies and the U.S. has learned to live without the Iranian market. And the same is true for the Iranians. They can do just fine without United States economy, but they're learning the hard way. The banking system is just one of those unique things, and having access to hard currency is something they need to work out a solution for. But my point is, the commercial side, yes, true. Obviously, we just had Federica Mogherini in Tehran when she talks about opening a European Union office. So these are realities that American policymakers are faced with. But there is this other issue of the bigger global American strategy. Where does Iran potentially fit in that? But regardless of the sort of decision that is taken here in Washington, it won't be easy because there's so many issues that keep U.S. and Iran still sort of at loggerheads.
Great. Thank you. Other questions?
Must have been heavy lunch today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure.